You know, when we talk about the American Civil War, our minds usually jump straight to the men, right? The soldiers, the generals, the politicians. But today, we're going to shift our focus. We're looking at the private sphere, at the women who were truly the heart of the family, the ones managing the home front through one of the biggest tests this country has ever seen.
So who did run that world? It's a huge question. While the men were off fighting on the battlefields, it was the women who were literally holding society together. In this explainer, we're going to dive into the incredible story of two very different groups of women whose lives were all tangled up on southern plantations, and how the war would completely change everything for them, forever. All right, here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at life before the war on a single plantation to see these two separate but connected worlds. Then, we'll see how the war itself created totally opposite experiences, fear for one group and a glimmer of hope for the other. We'll get to that pivotal moment of Jubilee, which was seen as both liberation and betrayal. After that, we'll follow both groups as they tried to build new lives from the ashes. And finally, we'll unpack the powerful legacies of resilience they both left behind. Okay, so to really get what changed, we first have to understand what life was like before. You have to picture this. On any given plantation, you've got these two distinct worlds existing right next to each other, almost on top of each other, but they are worlds apart. So in one world, you have the plantation mistress. Think of someone like Mary Elizabeth Dubose. Her world is the big house. And while her life was definitely one of privilege, don't for a second think it was a life of leisure. No way. She was basically the COO of a huge, complex operation, responsible for managing every single thing and every single person in that household. And the contrast here is just so stark. It defines this relationship that was incredibly close physically, but with an enormous distance in power. The mistress managed healthcare, food, clothing. She was the upholder of the whole social order. But for the enslaved women, well, they were the subjects of that management. They had zero rights, and their work, their labor, was the very engine that kept the mistress's entire world running. It's two groups of women on one piece of land, living in completely different realities. And then the men went to war. That one event just turned life on the plantation completely upside down. But, and this is the key, it was experienced in totally opposite ways. For one group, it meant fear. For the other, it sparked hope. All of a sudden, the plantation mistress was responsible for, well, for everything. We can see this so clearly in personal diaries, like those from Susan Jervey and Charlotte Ravenel. They're writing about directing harvests, trying to deal with finances that are just collapsing, and the growing shortages of basics like salt, coffee, medicine. And woven through all of that is this constant, gnawing anxiety and the terrifying fear of Union soldiers showing up at their door. I mean, that quote just says it all, doesn't it? It paints such a clear picture of their new reality. It's this deep isolation and this daily grinding struggle just to hold their families and their entire world together, as it was literally falling apart around them. But for enslaved women, the feeling was completely different. If you look at the WPA slave narratives, you see that the number one emotion was hope. The sound of Union troops wasn't a threat, it was a promise. Now, that hope was definitely mixed with a very real fear. A fear that as the Southern economy crashed, they or their kids could be sold off and moved away, separated forever. So you have all this tension building, and it all comes to a head in one massive, pivotal moment, the arrival of the Union Army. To one group of women, it sounded like doom. To the other, it sounded like freedom. The exact same event meant two completely different things. For the enslaved people, this moment had a name: Jubilee. And listen, this wasn't about freedom being given to them. It was about freedom being seized. The act of just walking off that plantation was the ultimate power move, a profound declaration that from that moment on, their lives were finally their own. I mean, just look at this comparison. It's night and day. The diaries of the mistresses describe pure chaos, a deep sense of betrayal by people they claimed to have cared for. But for the freed women, it was the total opposite. It was liberation. It was jubilee. It was the very beginning of a whole new world. So after the war, the world is fundamentally remade for absolutely everyone. And now both groups of women are facing this enormous challenge of having to build new lives in a South that was changed forever. For the former mistresses, this new reality was a massive shock to the system. It was called genteel poverty.
Their family fortunes were gone, their entire labor source was gone, and these elite women were suddenly thrown into a world they were not prepared for at all. Can you imagine learning to cook a meal for the first time, your hands having never done that kind of work before? They had to learn to clean, to sew, to do all the physical labor themselves. It wasn't just about losing money, it was a complete shattering of their identity.
For freed women, though, this new world was a canvas of possibility, even with all the incredible challenges. Their very first steps were these powerful acts of defining who they were. They searched for husbands and wives so they could finally marry legally, a right they'd always been denied. They fought to bring their families back together, knowing that now their children were safe from being sold away. They started their own homes, their own sanctuaries, and, so crucially, they built strong communities, usually centered around the church, and they flocked to schools to get an education, which wasn't just a tool, it was a powerful symbol of their freedom.
So when we step back and look at all this, what we see are two amazing stories of survival and adaptation. Both groups of women showed this incredible resilience, and both became the matriarchs who would go on to shape the future of the New South. Now, their legacies were completely distinct, but they were both incredibly formative. The plantation mistresses focused on holding their families together through poverty and defeat, preserving a family heritage that would shape the lost cause story for generations. At the exact same time, the freed women were building the literal foundations of the African American community, creating a brand new legacy of strength, family, and hope. And this is the most important part. These are not two separate stories. They're parallel, they're intertwined, and you absolutely cannot separate them. Both groups of women are the matriarchs of the complicated, shared American history that all of us have inherited. Which leaves us with one last thing to think about. How do the legacies of these matriarchs, these two very different stories of survival, one about preserving a past, the other about building a future, how do they continue to shape our families, our communities, and even our national conversation today?